The deal was supposed to be simple: a buyer, a seller, a few signatures, and another property changing hands. Instead, the meeting came to a complete stop when the closing attorney reviewed the ownership records one last time. He adjusted his glasses, frowned at the paperwork, and looked directly at the people sitting across from him. "I'm sorry," he said carefully, "but the individuals listed as sellers do not legally own this property." The smile instantly disappeared from my daughter-in-law's face. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. My son leaned forward in confusion. "That can't be right. There has to be some kind of mistake." The attorney calmly shook his head. "No mistake." Then his eyes shifted toward the conference room entrance because at that exact moment, I walked through the door. And that was the day my son and his wife finally discovered who really owned the house they had been trying to sell. But the story started long before that meeting. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 74 years old and I live just outside Lexington, Kentucky. Most of my life was spent working as a general contractor. It wasn't glamorous work. I wasn't rich. I simply built things with my hands, worked long hours, and took pride in earning an honest living. My late wife, Susan, often joked that I showed love through actions instead of words. Looking back, she was probably right. When our son Daniel was growing up, I wasn't the type of father who sat him down for long life lessons. Instead, I repaired his bicycle when it broke. I showed up for his baseball games. I worked overtime whenever school expenses appeared. I handled problems quietly and did my best to make sure my family never lacked what they needed. Susan and I were married for 43 years before cancer took her away. Anyone who has lost a spouse after that many years understands what happens afterward. The house becomes quieter, the evenings feel longer, and every room carries memories that never really leave. For nearly 2 years after Susan passed away, I lived alone. Then Daniel's life started falling apart. He had launched a small home renovation company with 2 business partners. At first, everything seemed promising. The company was growing. New contracts were coming in. The future looked bright. Then the economy slowed down. Several projects collapsed. One partner mishandled company funds. Another walked away completely. Within a year, the business was drowning in debt. I still remember the evening Daniel and his wife, Lauren, sat across from me at my kitchen table. Daniel looked exhausted. His shoulders seemed heavier than I had ever seen them. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't know how we're going to get through this." Lauren sat beside him. For once, she wasn't talking. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't offering opinions. She simply looked scared. Back then, they had 2 children, a daughter named Ava who was 8 years old and a son named Ethan who had just turned 6. The thought of those children losing stability broke my heart. So I did what fathers do. I helped. What neither Daniel nor Lauren knew was that years earlier, after Susan's death, I had already made an important financial decision. I sold our large family home and purchased another property through an LLC that my attorney helped establish. There was nothing secretive or illegal about it. It was simply part of my estate planning. The house was comfortable, located in a good neighborhood, with 4 bedrooms, a large backyard, and excellent schools nearby. When Daniel's business collapsed, I offered the property to him and his family. I told them they could live there for a very small monthly payment that barely covered taxes, insurance, and maintenance expenses. I never explained that I was the actual owner. At the time, it didn't seem necessary. They were family, and family was supposed to trust one another. For the first several years, everything seemed to work beautifully. We shared holidays. We ate dinner together. I attended school events for the grandchildren. Many weekends were spent watching old movies with Ava and Ethan while they sat beside me on the couch. Lauren appeared grateful. Daniel seemed relieved. For a while, it felt like we had survived a difficult chapter together. Then, little things started changing. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Family relationships rarely break all at once. They weaken one small crack at a time. Lauren began making comments. At first, they seemed harmless. "We'd have more room if Richard didn't keep so much stuff." Or, "It must be nice not having to worry about mortgage payments." I ignored them. Everyone gets frustrated sometimes. Everyone says things they don't mean. At least that's what I told myself. But over time, the remarks became sharper, more frequent, more personal. One evening, she became upset because I left a coffee cup in the sink. A single coffee cup. You would have thought I had damaged the entire kitchen. As she lectured me, I looked toward Daniel. I expected him to say something. Anything. Instead, he stared down at his dinner plate and remained silent. That silence hurt more than Lauren's criticism. Because strangers don't owe you loyalty. Your children do. As the years passed, more changes followed. Family plans happened without me. Furniture was moved from my room without permission. Birthday celebrations became shorter. Conversations stopped whenever I entered a room. I noticed every detail. Older people usually do. We've simply learned not to talk about it. The grandchildren remained the brightest part of my life. Ava and Ethan still hugged me, still asked for advice, still listened to my stories. But even that slowly changed as they grew older and their schedules became busier. Then one afternoon, while repairing part of the backyard fence, I overheard Lauren talking on speakerphone with a friend. I wasn't trying to listen, but certain words make it impossible not to. "This house is holding us back," she said. I froze. Her friend asked something I couldn't hear. Lauren laughed. "No, seriously. Once we sell it, we'll finally be able to move somewhere better." Sell it. The word hit me like a punch. I stood beside that fence, completely motionless. At first I felt confused, then shocked, because Lauren sounded absolutely certain, as though she truly believed the house belonged to her and Daniel. The conversation continued. She talked about future profits, bigger homes, better neighborhoods, new opportunities, and with every sentence, one fact became crystal clear. She had absolutely no idea who actually owned the property. That evening, I sat alone in my room holding one of my favorite photographs of Susan. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering if staying silent had been a mistake. At that moment, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was disappointed, because the house wasn't really the problem. The real problem was what Lauren's words revealed. Somewhere along the way, my son and his wife had stopped seeing me as family, and had started seeing me as an obstacle. After overhearing that conversation, I spent the next several weeks trying to convince myself that I had misunderstood what Lauren meant. Maybe she was only dreaming out loud. Maybe she was talking about possibilities instead of actual plans. Maybe my feelings were influencing my judgment. At my age, you learn that not every uncomfortable moment deserves an immediate reaction. Sometimes patience solves problems better than confrontation. So I stayed quiet. Life continued moving forward. Summer faded into autumn. The trees throughout the neighborhood turned bright shades of red, orange, and gold. The grandchildren returned to school. From the outside, we still looked like a normal American family. Inside the house, however, something had shifted. Lauren no longer seemed interested in hiding her frustration with me. One morning, she walked into the kitchen while I was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. She opened the refrigerator, sighed dramatically, and said, "You know, a lot of people your age prefer retirement communities." I lowered the paper. "A lot of people probably do," I replied. She nodded. "They have activities, friends, independence." The way she emphasized that last word made her meaning perfectly clear. I folded the newspaper and looked directly at her. "Are you trying to tell me something, Lauren?" "No," she said with a smile. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people use when they want you to understand a message without saying it directly. Over the following months, similar conversations became common. If the electric bill increased, somehow it was my fault. If the garage felt crowded, my belongings were the problem. If schedules became complicated, my presence was somehow contributing to the inconvenience. Daniel never openly joined her criticism, but he almost never challenged it either. And sometimes silence hurts just as much as agreement. One Saturday afternoon, I invited Daniel to lunch. Just the two of us. We met at a small diner we had visited for years. The place hadn't changed much. The same red booths, the same smell of coffee, the same waitress who seemed to know every customer by name. For a little while, things felt normal again. We talked about football, the weather, work, the grandchildren. Then I finally asked the question that had been sitting heavily on my heart. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Sure." I took a breath. "Are things okay between us?" He looked genuinely surprised. "What do you mean?" I studied his face. The face of the little boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The face of the teenager who once followed me around with endless questions. The face of the man I had spent decades trying to help. "It feels like you're pulling away from me." Daniel stared into his coffee. For several seconds, he didn't answer. That silence told me more than words ever could. Finally, he sighed. "Lauren's under a lot of stress." I nodded slowly. "I know she is. She's trying to think about the future." I waited. He rubbed his forehead. "Sometimes she feels like we're stuck." There it was. Not anger, not cruelty. Something almost worse. An excuse, a justification. The slow surrender of a man who no longer wanted conflict inside his marriage. I looked at him carefully. "And am I part of the reason she feels stuck?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His silence lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. Finally, he quietly said one word. "Sometimes." The answer hit harder than I expected. Not because he intended to hurt me, not because he raised his voice, but because I knew he was being honest. I paid for lunch. We shook hands, and both of us pretended the conversation had gone better than it actually had. That night I sat alone in my room thinking about the past, the overtime shifts, the weekends I gave up, the second mortgage Susan and I took years earlier to help pay for Daniel's college education, the financial support we provided after his business failed. At the time, none of those things had felt like sacrifices. They were simply what parents do. You help your children because you love them. You don't keep score. But sitting there in the quiet, I couldn't ignore a difficult truth. Love doesn't require gratitude, but it does require respect. And respect was slowly disappearing. A few weeks later, Thanksgiving arrived. The house filled with relatives, neighbors, and friends. Football played on the television while everyone gathered around the dining room table. At first, the evening seemed pleasant. Then the conversation turned toward retirement. One of Lauren's cousins asked whether I enjoyed having fewer responsibilities these days. I laughed. "Depends on the day." Before I could continue, Lauren jumped into the conversation. "Trust me, Richard doesn't have many responsibilities anymore." Several people chuckled politely. I smiled and let it go. Then she added another comment. "Sometimes having him around feels like raising another teenager." The room immediately became uncomfortable. Not completely silent, just quiet enough. The kind of quiet that follows a joke nobody actually finds funny. I looked around the table. Some people stared at their plates. Others forced awkward smiles. Then I looked at Daniel, my son. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look embarrassed. He simply continued eating. And in that moment, something inside me finally changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough. Enough to accept a truth I had spent years avoiding. I was no longer being treated like family. I was simply being tolerated. And even that tolerance seemed to be running out. December arrived shortly afterward. Christmas lights appeared throughout the neighborhood. Holiday music played everywhere. The grandchildren were excited for Christmas. For their sake, I tried to stay positive. But Lauren's behavior continued getting worse. One evening, I walked through the dining room and noticed several papers spread across the table. Property estimates, market reports, comparable home values, real estate information. Lauren quickly gathered everything when she saw me, but not before I had seen enough. The following morning, I called my attorney. His name was Robert Mercer. We had known each other for nearly 3 decades. After explaining everything, I met him at his office. Robert listened carefully. Then he reviewed the ownership records for the property. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Legally speaking, they can't sell that house." "I know. They aren't listed as owners." "I know." He studied me for a moment. "Then why haven't you told them?" That was the question, wasn't it? I looked out the office window. Because the answer wasn't legal. It was personal. "I keep hoping Daniel will remember who he is." Robert nodded slowly. "And if he doesn't?" For the first time, I allowed myself to seriously consider that possibility. The answer settled heavily inside my chest. "Then I'll have to do what needs to be done." Robert closed the file. "Whenever you're ready." I left his office feeling older than when I had arrived, not because of the paperwork, not because of the property, But because I was beginning to understand something painful, the greatest threat to our family wasn't Lauren. It was Daniel's willingness to stand beside her while she pushed me farther and farther away. And unfortunately, the worst part was still coming. Christmas Eve was only weeks away, and my son was about to make a decision neither of us would ever forget. The weeks leading up to Christmas should have felt warm and comforting. Instead, they felt like a countdown. By then, I had stopped lying to myself. The tension inside the house was impossible to ignore. Lauren barely concealed her irritation whenever I entered a room. Daniel always seemed exhausted, trapped somewhere between guilt and avoidance. And I spent more time alone than ever before. Not because anyone had ordered me to stay in my room, not yet, but because it was easier than enduring uncomfortable silences, easier than pretending everything was normal, easier than watching my own family slowly make it clear that I no longer belonged. Even so, I kept trying. For Ava and Ethan, I always tried. One Saturday afternoon, Ava knocked on my bedroom door. She was 16 by then, old enough to notice things adults thought they were hiding. "Grandpa? Come in." She sat on the edge of my bed. "You okay?" I smiled. "Why wouldn't I be?" She rolled her eyes. That made me laugh. Teenagers have a remarkable ability to see through polite lies. "You seem sad." For a moment I looked at her and decided to tell the truth. Sometimes adults make life more complicated than it needs to be. She nodded as if she understood more than I realized. Then she leaned forward and hugged me. No speech, no advice, just a hug. For a few seconds, the loneliness faded. Months later, I would still remember that moment, because it reminded me that not everyone in the family had forgotten who I was. A few days later, I overheard another conversation. This time, Lauren wasn't speaking to a friend. She was speaking to a real estate agent. I wasn't trying to listen. I was simply walking through the hallway when her voice reached me. "The buyers are very interested." I stopped. A short pause followed. Then she said, "We're hoping to close shortly after New Year's." The agent must have asked a question. Lauren laughed confidently. "Oh, ownership won't be an issue." I almost smiled. If only she knew. The confidence in her voice was astonishing. She genuinely believed she controlled everything: the house, the future, the family. She had absolutely no idea she was building plans on a foundation that belonged to someone else. For a brief moment, I considered telling her the truth, ending the entire charade. But something stopped me. Maybe it was disappointment. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe I needed to know whether Daniel would eventually do the right thing on his own. So I waited. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. A light snowfall had covered the neighborhood the night before. The streets looked like something from a holiday postcard. Snow-covered rooftops, decorated trees, children pulling sleds through front yards. Susan would have loved it. I missed her terribly that day, more than usual. Because if she had still been alive, none of this would have happened. She always noticed trouble long before anyone else did. Relatives filled the house that evening. Lauren's family arrived first. Neighbors stopped by later. The grandchildren moved from room to room carrying gifts and plates of food. Everyone smiled. Everyone laughed. From the outside, we looked like a happy family celebrating Christmas together. Inside, I felt strangely disconnected, like I was watching someone else's life. Dinner passed peacefully. The grandchildren opened presents. Photos were taken. People exchanged hugs and holiday wishes. For a few hours, everything felt almost normal. Then the guests slowly started leaving. Cars pulled away. Coats disappeared from hooks. Voices faded. By 10 o'clock, only 4 of us remained. Me, Daniel, Lauren, and an uncomfortable silence. The atmosphere changed immediately. Some moments announce themselves before anything actually happens. This was one of those moments. Lauren glanced at Daniel. Daniel looked down at the floor. A knot formed in my stomach. "Can we talk?" Lauren asked. I nodded. "Of course." She motioned toward the living room. I followed them. And that's when I saw it. A suitcase, standing beside the front door. At first, I didn't understand. Then the truth hit me. The realization came so suddenly that I felt cold. Lauren sat down. Daniel remained standing. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them looked confused. This had been planned, discussed, agreed upon. Lauren folded her hands together. We've been talking about the future. I said nothing. We think it's time for some changes. Still, I remained silent. We need more space. Daniel nodded. We need privacy. He nodded again. Each nod felt like another door closing. Then Lauren finally said what she had clearly rehearsed. We think you'd be happier living somewhere else. Somewhere else. Not another room. Not a different arrangement. Gone. Daniel finally spoke. Dad, there are some really nice senior apartments nearby. I stared at him. The little boy who once asked me to check under his bed for monsters. The teenager whose broken heart I helped heal after his first serious breakup. The young man I rescued when his business collapsed. And now he couldn't even look me in the eye. Quietly, I asked him one question. Is this what you want? Several painful seconds passed. Then he nodded. Yeah. One word. A single word. Yet it felt devastating. Lauren pointed toward the suitcase. We packed some essentials for you. Essentials. As if I were checking out of a hotel. Then she smiled. A smile I would never forget. The best Christmas gift you could give us is to disappear. The room became completely still. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, everything I believed about my family shattered. I looked at Daniel one final time, waiting, hoping, giving him one last opportunity to stop this, to say something, anything. He didn't. His silence was his answer. Strangely enough, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them of everything I had sacrificed, and I didn't reveal who owned the house. Instead, I picked up the suitcase and walked toward the door. Lauren looked relieved. Daniel looked miserable. Neither of them tried to stop me. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside. Christmas lights glowed across the snowy street. For several seconds, I stood there holding that suitcase. A 74-year-old man carrying his belongings in a single bag, forced out of a house that legally belonged to him. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. I drove to a small motel about 20 minutes away. Nothing fancy, just a clean room and a bed. After checking in, I sat alone on the edge of the mattress. The silence felt enormous. For years after Susan's death, I thought I understood grief. But this felt different. This was betrayal. And for the first time in a very long time, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The way older men cry when nobody is watching. Eventually, I wiped my eyes and looked at the clock. Then I made a decision. The waiting was over. The hoping was over. The excuses were over. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and called the one person who already knew the truth. Robert Mercer, my attorney. He answered on the second ring. Richard. I took a deep breath. It's time. Robert was silent for a moment after hearing those words. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Are you certain? I looked around the motel room. The suitcase sat beside the bed. A suitcase my own family had packed for me. A suitcase handed to me on Christmas Eve as though I were an inconvenience that needed to be removed. For months I had hoped things would improve. For months I had given Daniel chance after chance to remember who he was. There was nothing left to wait for. Yes, I said, I'm certain. Robert exhaled slowly. All right. The next few weeks passed in an unusual kind of peace. Not happiness, not anger, just clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to manage everyone else's choices. I rented a small furnished apartment on a month-to-month lease. It wasn't impressive. A bed, a recliner, a kitchen table. That was about it. Yet somehow, I felt more comfortable there than I had in the larger house. There was no tension, no criticism. No feeling that I needed to walk carefully through my own home. Just silence. The kind that heals instead of hurts. During that time, Ava called me twice. The first call came only a few days after Christmas. She sounded worried. Grandpa, where are you? I chose my words carefully. I'm staying somewhere else for a little while. Why? Children notice far more than adults think they do, even teenagers, especially teenagers. I just needed some time. She didn't sound convinced. Honestly, neither was I. but I wasn't about to drag her into a conflict between adults. The second call came about a week later. This time she sounded upset. "Mom says you're being stubborn." I almost laughed. Of all the words Lauren could have chosen. Not heartbroken, not betrayed, not abandoned. Stubborn. "Do you think I'm stubborn?" I asked. Ava was quiet for a second. Then she answered, "No." One simple word. But unlike the single word Daniel had given me on Christmas Eve, this one carried kindness. A few days later, Robert called. "They've scheduled the closing." I leaned back in my chair. "When?" "February 17th. The date hung in the air. After months of uncertainty, the moment had finally arrived. Oddly enough, I wasn't excited. I wasn't nervous either. Mostly I felt sad, because none of this should have happened. People love stories about revenge. They imagine dramatic victories and humiliating defeats. Real life rarely works that way. When families fall apart, nobody truly wins. Someone always loses something valuable. Sometimes everyone does. Closing day arrived cold and gray. The title company occupied a modest office building near downtown Lexington. I arrived early. Robert met me in the parking lot. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so." He studied my face. "You don't have to go in there." "Yes, I do." Because this was never really about real estate. It was about truth. And the truth had waited long enough. We entered through a side entrance and remained in a separate conference room. The title company had already been informed about the ownership records. Everyone knew the paperwork would eventually expose the problem. No one knew how dramatic the reaction would be. At 10 o'clock, Daniel and Lauren arrived. Later, Robert told me that Lauren looked excited. Apparently, she had already been discussing moving plans, new furniture, a bigger home, a fresh start, all financed by money from a sale that was never going to happen. The buyers arrived shortly afterward, a retired couple relocating from Tennessee. By all accounts, decent people, completely unaware they had walked into the middle of a family disaster. The meeting began normally. Documents were reviewed, identification was checked, signatures were prepared. Then the title attorney noticed the ownership issue. At first there was confusion, then concern. Then came the moment that changed everything. The attorney adjusted his glasses and looked up. "I'm sorry," he said, "but we have a problem." Lauren frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The individuals listed as sellers do not own this property." The room went silent. "What are you talking about?" Lauren asked. The attorney turned several pages. "According to county records, this property is owned by Bennett Residential Holdings, LLC. Daniel leaned forward. "There has to be some mistake." "There isn't." Lauren shook her head. "That's impossible." The attorney remained calm. "The records are very clear." The buyers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody enjoys sitting in the middle of someone else's family conflict. Then the attorney spoke again. "The managing member of the LLC is present today." And that was when Robert opened the conference room door. I stepped inside. Everything stopped. I will never forget the expressions on their faces. Lauren looked confused, then shocked, then frightened. Daniel simply stared, as if his mind refused to process what he was seeing. I walked to the table and sat down across from them. Nobody spoke. Finally, Lauren found her voice. "Richard?" I nodded. "Hello, Lauren. What is this?" The confidence she had carried for months disappeared completely. The woman who had ordered me out of the house suddenly looked very small. I folded my hands calmly. "The house belongs to me." The words landed like thunder. Daniel's face immediately lost color. "No." "Yes." For the first time in months, I looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in months, he couldn't look away. "I purchased that property 10 years ago." Silence. "I allowed you to live there because I loved you." Silence. "I charged far less than market rent." Silence. "I paid for repairs and maintenance." Silence. "I never asked for gratitude." Lauren's eyes filled with tears. The buyers quietly excused themselves from the room. I couldn't blame them. This wasn't their battle. Then I said the one thing that truly mattered. All I ever wanted was respect. Daniel lowered his head. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Finally, he whispered, Oh my God. Not because of the money, not because the sale had collapsed, but because at that moment, he finally saw the entire picture. The years of support, the sacrifices, the patience, the opportunities, the Christmas Eve suitcase. Everything. Lauren suddenly began apologizing. The words came quickly, one after another. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to explain herself, but I barely heard any of it. Apologies that arrive only after consequences always sound different, not necessarily dishonest, just late, very late. Eventually, Daniel looked at me. His eyes were red. "I'm sorry, Dad." For a brief moment, I saw the little boy he used to be, the boy who trusted me completely, the boy who once believed I could solve any problem, and somehow, that made the situation harder instead of easier. Because love never truly disappears, even when trust does. I nodded slowly. I know. Then I explained what would happen next. The arrangement was over. They would need to find another place to live. I wasn't throwing them out immediately. I would give them reasonable time to make other arrangements, but they could no longer remain in the house under the same agreement. The consequences of their decisions had finally arrived. Nobody argued, nobody protested. There was simply nothing left to say. As the meeting ended, Daniel remained seated at the table, staring down at the paperwork, staring at the damage he had helped create. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something unexpected. Not victory. Relief. The truth was finally out. The strange thing about justice is that it rarely feels the way people imagine. Movies teach us that revenge comes with celebration, a dramatic speech, a perfect ending. Real life is much quieter. The morning after the meeting, I woke up in the same small apartment. The same coffee maker sat on the kitchen counter. The same winter sunlight filtered through the blinds. Nothing looked different, yet everything had changed. For months, I had imagined that revealing the truth would make me feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. Because while I had protected my dignity, I had also accepted a painful reality. The family I remembered no longer existed in the form I once knew. That realization took time to process. Fortunately, time has a way of helping old wounds breathe. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melted, the trees became green again. And for the first time in years, I started making decisions entirely for myself. Not for Daniel, not for Lauren, not for anyone else, just for me. A few months after the failed sale, I purchased a small house near a lake community about 45 minutes outside Lexington. It wasn't large. In fact, it was less than half the size of the old property. But it felt peaceful. The front porch overlooked the water. There was a walking trail nearby. Most of my neighbors were retired people who understood an important lesson. Life becomes lighter when people stop competing and start appreciating what they already have. Within a few weeks, I developed new routines. Morning walks, fishing, coffee with neighbors, volunteer work at a local veteran support center. Nothing extraordinary, just simple things that made life meaningful again. One afternoon, while helping organize donated supplies, another volunteer told a joke. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes naturally, not the polite kind, not the forced kind. The moment surprised me, because I realized something. For months, I had been so focused on surviving betrayal that I had forgotten I was still allowed to enjoy life. That realization felt like freedom. Summer arrived, then autumn. The leaves changed colors once again, and slowly, very slowly, my anger faded. The memories remained, the lessons remained, but the anger lost its grip. One advantage of growing older is learning that carrying resentment hurts you far more than the person you're angry with. Then, late one October afternoon, my phone rang. The screen displayed Daniel's name. I stared at it for several seconds. Part of me considered letting the call go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." There was a long pause. Then I heard his voice. "Dad." He sounded different, quieter, older somehow. "Yes?" Another pause. Then he spoke. "I was wondering if I could see you. Not borrow money, not ask for help, not discuss the house, just see me." I thought about it for a moment. Then I agreed. We met the following weekend at a small diner located halfway between our homes. The kind of place where ordinary people have difficult conversations every day. Nothing fancy, just coffee, pie, and honesty. Daniel arrived early. When I walked inside, I almost didn't recognize him. The confidence he once carried was gone. In its place was something much more genuine: humility. After we ordered coffee, neither of us spoke for a minute. Finally, he looked directly at me. "I'm sorry." I nodded. Then he continued. He didn't rush. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame Lauren. For nearly 20 minutes, he spoke honestly. He talked about his failures, his weakness, his fear of conflict, his willingness to protect peace in his marriage instead of doing what was right. Then he said something that stayed with me. I keep replaying Christmas Eve in my head. I looked at him. His eyes were wet. "Good." He seemed surprised. "Good?" "Yes." He frowned. I spoke gently. "If it still hurts, that means you learned something." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he slowly nodded. I think he understood. People often think forgiveness means pretending something never happened. It doesn't. Forgiveness means recognizing the damage while choosing not to live inside it forever. By the end of lunch, nothing was magically repaired. Trust doesn't work that way. Trust is built slowly, destroyed quickly, and rebuilt even more slowly. But something important had happened. We had started. Over the months that followed, our relationship improved little by little. Not overnight, not dramatically, just one honest conversation at a time. Phone calls became more frequent. Visits became less uncomfortable. And for the first time in years, Daniel stopped pretending difficult topics didn't exist. Lauren remained distant at first. Honestly, I couldn't blame her. Embarrassment has a way of making people avoid those they've hurt. But eventually she reached out too. Her apology was different from Daniel's. Quieter, less polished, more hesitant. In some ways, that made it easier to believe. I accepted it. Not because she had instantly earned forgiveness, not because the past no longer mattered, but because carrying bitterness served no purpose anymore. Life is simply too short for that. Before long, Ava and Ethan started visiting my lake house regularly. We spent afternoons fishing. We played cards on the porch. We shared stories over dinner. And every time I watched them laughing beside the water, I felt grateful. Not for what had happened, but for what I had learned. The following Christmas arrived almost exactly 1 year after the night I was handed that suitcase. This time, things looked very different. I hosted Christmas dinner at my own home. Nothing extravagant, just family, good food, and honest conversation. At one point during the evening, I stepped outside onto the porch. The lake reflected Christmas lights from nearby houses. The air was cold, peaceful, beautiful. For a few minutes, I stood there alone, thinking, remembering, and missing Susan. I found myself imagining what she would have said about everything that had happened. Probably something simple, something wise, something like, "People eventually show you who they are, but don't let their mistakes change who you are." And she would have been right, because the biggest lesson wasn't about property ownership, it wasn't about exposing lies, and it certainly wasn't about revenge. The real lesson was about self-respect. For years, I had confused love with endless sacrifice. I believed being a good father meant accepting everything, tolerating everything, excusing everything. I was wrong. Love matters, generosity matters, family matters, but boundaries matter too. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and even for the people you love is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. That lesson arrived late in my life, but not too late. As I stood on the porch looking across the water, I realized something else. If Christmas Eve had never happened, I probably would have continued living exactly as I was, making excuses, ignoring disrespect, convincing myself that peace was more important than dignity. Instead, I learned that peace built on self-sacrifice eventually becomes resentment. Real peace comes from knowing your value and refusing to surrender it. Inside the house, I could hear laughter. Ava was telling one of her stories. Ethan was arguing about a football game. Daniel was helping clear the table, and Lauren was talking with relatives in the kitchen. The family wasn't perfect. Maybe it never had been, but it was finally honest. And honesty gives relationships a chance to heal. A year earlier, I had stood alone in the snow holding a suitcase, certain that everything important in my life was falling apart. Now I stood on my own porch, watching lights reflect across the lake, understanding that sometimes losing one chapter is the only way to begin a better one. The pain had been real, the betrayal had been real, but so was the recovery, so was the growth, and so was the lesson. Never allow someone else's appreciation to determine your value, because your worth does not disappear simply because someone fails to recognize it. And if the people you love forget everything you've done for them, don't make the mistake of forgetting it yourself. That Christmas, I finally understood something my wife had known all along. Love should be given freely, respect should be mutual, and self-respect should never be negotiable. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been taken for granted by someone you loved? And if you were in Richard's position, what would you have done? Share your answer in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and I always enjoy hearing your perspective. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful family drama, betrayal, justice, and second chance stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Take care of yourself, value your worth, and remember, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand up for yourself with dignity. See you in the next story.